Welcome to the 34th Public Land Law Conference, hosted by the University of Montana Public Land and Resources Law Review. My name is Josh Nichols, and I am Editor-in-Chief of this year's Law Review. This year's staff is proud to present Strengthening Our Roots, Forest Law and Policy in a Changing World. This year's editors and staff members overcame several obstacles to make this event happen. And I'm not just talking about last-minute panelist cancellations, the Missoula Airport deciding to close this week, of all weeks, or the Montana Bar Association hosting its annual meeting in Kalispell this week, of all weeks. That's all minor stuff. There's an even bigger hurdle that a group like this must overcome to put on an event like this. You see, those attracted to being part of a law review dedicated to public land and resources issues are typically those who like to get out and play on our public lands and experience our natural resources. When you consider that a majority of the heavy lifting and planning this conference was done this past summer by people who are most often found running rivers, bagging peaks, cranking on single track, and slaying trout, it's amazing we kept this crew indoors, away from the beautiful western Montana summer, long enough to throw this thing together. But here we are. We brought together more than 30 experts from all over Montana, the western United States, and the entire country to discuss an array of topics outlined in your programs. Before I turn the stage over to this fine group, I would like to take a brief moment to recognize this year's staff for the hard work they've put in planning this conference. And I'm going to ask each of you to please stand up and stay standing when I recognize you. First, our two conference editors, Dave Wisenand and Matt Pugh. Where are they at? Okay, there's Matt back there, and Dave's probably still being a conference editor out in the hallway. Publication editors, John Wright and Jesse Froling. You're supposed to stay standing, Pugh. Thanks. Online publication editor, Amanda Shamp Anderson. Business editor, Pat Beto. Managing editor, Matt Newman. And then staff members, Heather Baltus, Talisi Brooks, Matt Jennings, Brad Jones, Dustin Leftridge, Alexa Sample, and Ben Sudduth. If anyone has any questions, concerns, or logistical issues that come up in the next day or two, please find one of these people. If they don't have an immediate answer, they can find you an answer, or they'll make something up. It's also important to note that this conference is 2 years in the making, and last year's Public Lands Law Review played a role in laying the groundwork and planning this year's conference. What I want you to take away from that fact is this. If you enjoy and are impressed with what you see the next 2 days, feel free to give credit to anyone that was just standing in the room. If you're disappointed with what you see and hear the next 2 days, just do what we do and blame those bums on last year's Law Review. All joking aside, we really do need to thank last year's team, particularly conference editors Brad Dixon and Jen Hillhart, for initiating contact with many of the people you will hear speak today. Please join me in a round of applause for thanking past Law Review members and the great group of people that was just standing. A couple more quick acknowledgments before we start. It takes money to pull off an event like this. And we would not have had the guy who literally wrote the book on public lands law, Charles Wilkinson, here last night and today, had it not been for the generous financial support of our dean, Irma Russell, who is unable to be here today. We would also like to thank the following sponsors and supporters: Professor Jack Tucholsky, Professor Ray Cross, Jory Ruggiero of Western Justice Associates, Professor Sarah Bates, the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources section of the Federal Bar Association, and the University of Montana School of Law. Finally, if you read yesterday's Missoulian, you would have seen a forest issue in the headlines. What perfect timing, the week of our conference. And one of our goals in hosting this event is to keep it as current, timely, and as cutting edge as possible. And therefore, a change has been suggested for the final panel of the conference. For the Healthy Forest, Healthy Economy panel, it has been suggested that the experts weigh in with their opinions on the economic impact of the clear cutting of 3,000 marijuana plants spread over 3 acres of Lolo National Forest valued at $8 million. If you haven't seen that story yet, you should check it out. But it's a suggestion. Moderator and panelists can run with it if they would like. And one final note, discussing this conference with Professor Wilkinson this morning over breakfast, he hit on how fortunate University of Montana law students are to study environmental and natural resources law in a community that really lives in its environment and amongst these natural resources. You know, we're not in a far-off college talking about far-off issues. We live in this stuff, and you see it in the local news, you hear it in local conversations, and you see it in a room full of people at a conference like this. So I'm not going to say any more about today or tomorrow's lineup because the array of issues that are going to be examined by this year's distinguished panelists are best left to the distinguished panelists themselves. In closing, thank you again for caring enough about forest use and management to attend the 2011 Public Land Law Conference. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today. Thank you. And you've got me for 2 more seconds. Session 1 today is a century after the Big Burn, evolution of forest regulation. And today's moderator is one of my professors this semester, Sarah Bates, and she is Senior Associate at the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. Panelists include Jack Ward Thomas, former Chief of the Forest Service and Professor Emeritus at the University of Montana College of Forestry and Conservation. We also have Tim Presso, Staff Attorney in the Bozeman Office of Earth Justice, and Dave Stack, Executive Director of the National Museum of Forest Service History.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the organizers of this year's conference. I've been fortunate enough to attend quite a few of these programs and to work with the students in some years past to put them on. It's a ton of work, and it has really paid off this year in just a fabulous lineup of speakers, starting with Charles Wilkinson's wonderful presentation last night and really impressive audience give and take with him afterwards, too. That set the tone for a really wonderful and stimulating program. I hope we continue that today. I'm sure that we will. So this opening session is an opportunity to talk a bit, to learn a bit about the background of the laws, regulations, and policies that guide the Forest Service in all of its various management actions. We collectively refer to these in the program as forest regulation. National forest management is really an ongoing negotiation of relationships between the federal, state, and local governments, between the 3 branches of government, and between public and private interests. We all know that relationships are messy. They're always evolving, and that's true with the Forest Service and all of those parties that it's in relationship with. So we'll hear today a bit in this first session about the birth of the agency, really the birth of a forward-looking and progressive idea of sustainable land and resource management that rose in response to conditions that were unique to the turn of the 20th century, including the Big Burn of 1910, to which the title of our session refers, as well as decades of unrestrained exploitation of our forests. We'll also hear about pressures that are on the agency and how these pressures have grown over the decades and how they're reflected in new and sometimes conflicting mandates that guide and sometimes complicate management of these natural resources. We'll hear some suggestions for how this might be straightened out. Food for thought as we launch into this conference on the future of the Forest Service. And we think about our relationship with the lands and the resources that it's responsible for managing. As Josh mentioned, we have 3 fine speakers to get us going in this conversation. We'll have each of them, we've asked each to prepare about 10 minutes of remarks, and then so to leave plenty of time for all of us to interact with them, ask questions, challenge them, and for them to discuss amongst themselves. We'll go in the order in which they're seated up here. So we're starting with Dave Stack, who's the Executive Director and the Vice President of the National Museum of Forest Service History, a nonprofit organization founded in 1988 dedicated to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the entire national history of the Forest Service for the education and enjoyment of the general public, scholars, and historical researchers. This organization's raising $12.7 million to construct a museum building in Missoula and to establish a national education program with traveling exhibits. Dave Stack was a professional forester with the Forest Service, and his last assignment was with the Missoula Ranger District and the Lolo National Forest. He retired in September of '99 after 33 years of service. Please join me in welcoming Dave Stack.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you just a few ideas on the kind of the historical background, which I think are important on this subject of regulation. While the core of the Forest Service management philosophy has remained consistent throughout its history, the National Forest Management continues to evolve because of new science, technology, changing public values and needs. I've listed what I think are some of the core Forest Service management philosophies that the agency began with and I think continue today. The first is a decentralized agency. I think this was one of the important reasons for Gifford Pinchot and others to suggest a new agency to manage the public lands. One of the reasons that Pinchot favored a decentralized agency was quick response to the public needs. Another aspect of the agency has been professional science, being professional in science-based management. The science, of course, has changed over time, and the number of professional disciplines have increased over time, but that still remains consistent. Multiple use, although it wasn't called multiple use in 1905, Pinchot and others talked about many different uses on the national forest. Sustainability of resources was an important aspect, too, of becoming a professional managed agency, managing that natural resource. And for sure that continues today. Regulation of uses. This was an important aspect because up until the Forest Service was established in 1905, there was really no regulation of uses on the national forest lands, the forest reserves, which were later renamed the National Forest. One of the biggest issues facing the Forest Service in its infancy was the regulation of grazing use. There was a tremendous disagreement among the users of the range that the Forest Service even had the ability to charge for use or regulate for use. And last but not least was the greatest good policy, which basically Pinchot articulated as, from when they're making decisions, the decisions would be made for the greatest good, the greatest number in the long run. Of course, that opens up a lot of debate on all different aspects of that, and everybody has their different opinion on what's the greatest good for the greatest number. So I think from the title of our panel is about the Great Burn, and what changes did that cause? Timothy Egan in his book, The Great Burn, I thought there were three important lessons that I pulled out from that. One was the congressional support was really minimal before the agency, before the 1910 fire. There were several powerful congressmen, including Senator Hayburn from Wallace, that really were opposed to the idea of public management of the public lands. After that, public attitude changed and Congress increased support. Much of that probably change of public attitude was probably the responsibility and came from the campaign that former President Theodore Roosevelt and Pinchot went on to speaking engagements and gave a lot of publicity on the need to revitalize the agency, give them the tools and the people that they needed to work with. Also, the agency redoubled the commitment to suppress all wildfires. And the regional forester at that time, William Greeley, who later became the third chief, his policy probably departed somewhat from maybe what the first chief, Pinchot, maybe would have done. But anyway, that was the government policy that was followed for many, many years. Some other examples of change I'd like to just touch on. There's a policy or the changing values, and this value is probably internal within the agency, and that was the first administrative wilderness designation that was promoted by Aldo Leopold, Arthur Carhart, and others when in 1924 the Gila Wilderness Area was established, which later in 1964 led to the Wilderness Act and a lot of the issues we're facing today. There's changing public need. Many times agency management has changed because of the need of the country has changed. In 1940s, with the war looming, and during the war, the whole country was focused on producing commodities, supporting the war effort, and the Forest Service was part of that huge effort, including increasing mineral extraction, increasing logging. Even the Forest Products Laboratory got very much in research on how to help the national defense, going down to how the wood is used to construct ships, and it's a very interesting history in itself. Then another example of changing need is after the war, the whole economy was built on development. The returning GIs needed homes to live, so increased logging was occurring at that time, mining, energy development. So we wanted to return our economy, we wanted to grow our economy, and the Forest Service was part of that. There's an example, too, of changing science and public values. In the 1960s, there was a tremendous awakening of the environmental values that forests produce: clean water, clean air, and wildlife, and all those different aspects. And that changed and implemented a lot of new laws that the Forest Service had to adhere to and follow. In the 1980s, more science was learned about how this ecosystem worked and it was put together, and that changed the focus of the Forest Service management and how they looked at different projects in the future. My conclusion, since we're talking about regulation, is the need for regulatory growth is really related to the increasing pressure on resources brought by the growing population and the desire to use the national forest resources and other public lands. So I look forward to your questions.
We're going to just blow through our speakers and then do lots of conversation and questions, I think. But thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is Jack Ward-Thomas, who, those of you who were at the presentation last night, heard a bit from Jack. Jack's the former chief of the Forest Service and professor emeritus at the University of Montana College of Forestry and Conservation. He's devoted more than half a century to conservation, including 10 years with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, 30 years with the Forest Service, including being the top-graded research scientist and chief, 10 years as the Boone and Crockett Professor here at the University of Montana, and 3 years now as consultant and writer. He has over 500 publications to his credit, including 4 prize-winning books. And I just want to mention that one of the books that you published, I received 30 years ago as a seasonal worker working for a district ranger in the Kootenai National Forest, and the district ranger said, here's the book you need to carry with you and learn from. And I still have it. I've been carrying it around all those years since. Great book, very influential. So please join me in welcoming Jack Ward-Thomas.
Not that I want to sell you any books, but for those of you interested in this sort of thing, there is one called Journals of a Forest Service Chief, which the journals I kept while I was chief. And if you want to understand the political chaos with which the chief operates, read that book. Go, stop, don't stop, go faster, back off. It was some of my frustrations. I intend to be deliberately provocative today, and I'll start by saying that the Forest Service is bogged down in an increasing crisis. I think the status quo is increasingly intolerable. Now, how did that come about? One can conclude that the mission is clearly spelled out in law. The Organic Act, 1897, is amended by the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960. To wit, the Organic Act says to improve and protect the forest, 2, secure favorable conditions of water flows, and 3, furnish a continuous supply of timber. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act added to that and said we're going to be interested in outdoor recreation, range management, defined by livestock grazers, and wildlife and fish purposes. And then it was left to the Forest Service of how do you make all that fit together. Later those instructions were added to, and many people would say superseded, by some single-purpose act. The Endangered Species Act, whose clear purpose is stated, the conservation of ecosystems upon which T&E species may depend. That was laid there quietly and over time became the overwhelming mission in many cases. Presidential direction about 1995 said this is critical. It said we're going to absorb the impacts of dealing with T&E species on public lands first. That still is direction today, whether we like to know it or not. Forest Service regulations relative to maintenance of viable populations of all native and desirable non-native vertebrates well distributed in the planting area was clearly intended by its authors as philosophical guidance. Then the courts took that guidance literally, and it's proved impossible to execute technically, fiscally, and in terms of time. Just to elaborate on that, we talked last night about the committee of scientists came down and says, okay, we're going to put the science to it. We're going to have indicator species, and that's science. That's a hypothesis, which has never really yet been tested. But we know there's not enough money in the entire world to sample all of those species within statistical parameters year after year after year, and then be able to determine whether the fluctuations are habitat affected or whether they're perturbations in the system. To be able to know that will take many years. So when the courts took that guidance literally, we were in a new game. The court's interpretation has proved impossible as Forest Service efforts to amend the regulation have been turned back time after time by the courts. We have a bum hypothesis that we cannot execute, do not have the money, the people, or the time, and I'm not sure it could be done in any circumstance. But yet, that's where we are. All management activities taken to satisfy the varied missions are going to have adverse impacts on other things. There is no free lunch. We seem to be moving to the point that we want no adverse impact, no matter how temporary. That's not possible and to manage at the same time because there are always negative impacts. Regulatory agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, Environmental Protection Agency, and the Council on Environmental Quality have become ever more engaged in grading national forest management. This oversight takes place in no recognizably coherent fashion, focusing attention on the public lands, which is, I promise you, much more politically attractive than addressing activities on private lands or state lands. Over time, single-purpose laws such as the ESA, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water, and others took precedent due to the accumulation of court decisions over the more generalized direction in the Organic Act, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, and others. It became clear over time that the maintenance of biodiversity and assuring sustainability takes precedence over old mission statements, even though they are what the law says our mission is. Maintenance of the status quo, that is, thwarting of any significant management action on national forests for any purpose, has become the objective of some individuals and organizations. And in total, they have to be viewed as most successful. The Equal Access to Justice Act stimulated increased legal challenge, including those of the Forest Service. The act provides a payday for litigants if they prevail, and no liability to the taxpayers of the United States if they lose. Such a deal. Now, would I say that we don't want the Forest Service to obey the law? We absolutely do. But Forest Service wins many more of those cases than they lose, but it causes a lot of change in direction. In response, Forest Service tried to suit-proof the decisions, but through providing overwhelming volumes of information and details in forest plans and environmental impact statements. That worked really poorly as a defensive strategy. While it alienated many citizens by burying them in the volume and complexity of the paperwork. Finally, given the confusion in law, especially in their interactions, wild swings in direction from administrations and Congresses, when coupled with inconsistent, confusing decisions from numerous and continuing court decisions, has resulted in management becoming ever more expensive and in many cases unlikely to occur at all because it's simply cheaper to do nothing than to try to do something. Over the last century, the pendulum of political direction swung wildly from protection to enhanced production of commodities back to protection and to the point of where we are today. Over time, it became more rational, just step back from active management and certainly any large-scale management. As a consequence, a combination of factors, developing stand conditions, insect outbreaks, proliferation of dead and dying trees in some places, impacts of ongoing climate change, and construction of more houses in the wildland-urban interface has produced a renewed focus on wildfire. As wood products and companies increasingly convert to real estate investment trust, there were and likely will be more and more homes built in that interface, often adjacent to the national forest. You can expect more Forest Service resources and money and personnel to be diverted to fire prevention and control. Coincident to budget austerity. Who picks up the tab? Who should? The Forest Service timber program essentially collapsed from near 13 billion board feet to some 3 to 4 billion board feet in the late 1980s and early 90s. That collapse, coupled with the diminution of the private sector timber industry, took away powerful constituencies for the Forest Service programs. The loss of support from industry, its employees, state and local governments, state agencies, left the Forest Service without effective advocates. Environmental advocates, having won most of the battles, have not, by and large, become advocates for Forest Service programs. Today, national forests are being discussed as liabilities as opposed to precious assets. Today, we obtain more and more of our needed wood products from elsewhere. In that process, adverse environmental consequences, dollars, and jobs are exported to elsewhere in return for wood from nations with low wages and little evidence of environmental concern. Considering our present economic, social, political situation, a truly significant question is begged and demands an answer. Is such outright exploitation of poorer nations socially, economically, ecologically, and ethically acceptable for both the United States and for elsewhere? Forest Service employees have, over the last 3 decades, become increasingly uncertain of their mission. Scholars have identified them as a seriously demoralized workforce. Forest Service folks don't like that. They long to hear a certain trumpet around which to rally. And surely it's a responsibility, or even the duty of those who rule, to compose new notes for a certain call to clearly define duty. The management of the Forest Service has become confused to the point of inducing a degree of paralysis in management action beyond fighting wildfire. Surely that's intolerable in the long run. More and more citizens, even elected ones, know it. The situation, considering the economic, social state of the nation, will be increasingly intolerable. So more and more citizens are asking the ancient question, Quo vadis, where goest thou? The Forest Service, if it ever did, no longer has the power to significantly influence its own destiny. Only the people can do that, and they need to hurry up and do it. Without a clear answer, the National Forest will be increasingly considered an economic liability. Without influential advocates, besieged by critics across a wide spectrum, starved for personnel and resources, and vulnerable to devolution of mission and lands to other entities. A new day for the Forest Service has arrived, but we don't know what it entails. But the past is the past. It's time to let go of that past and look on to the future. I firmly believe the Forest Service people are as capable as ever, maybe more so. They are as well led as ever, maybe even more so. They are as dedicated as in the past, maybe more so. They are not the problem. We, the people, are the problem. Only we, the citizens of our nation, can assure that certain trumpet that will allow the Forest Service to show what it can do when the mission is clear and resources are made available. The current state of affairs is clearly intolerable. The situation cannot and will not persist. It's time to move on. But to where? Carpe diem, seize the day. Now is the time to clarify that mission.
Thank you, Jack. And our next speaker is Timothy Prezo, a staff attorney in the Northern Rockies Office of Earth Justice, a national public interest environmental law firm. After graduating from Georgetown Law School, he served as law clerk for the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, then worked for a law firm in Washington, D.C., and joined Earth Justice in 2000. His docket has focused on numerous public land and wildlife issues, including defense of the Forest Service roadless area conservation rule, protection of the Rocky Mountain Front and North Fork Flathead River in Montana, conservation of the grizzly bear, wolverine, and lynx, and regulation of off-road vehicle use in the Gallatin, Lewis and Clark, and Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forests. Please join me in welcoming Tim Prezo.
Thank you. Good morning. For those of you who don't know what Earth Justice is, it's not Earth First. I'm not going to chain myself to anything this morning, in case you're concerned. Earth Justice, formerly the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, has for 30 years been the nation's leading public interest environmental law firm, and we have offices stretching from New York to Honolulu. The Northern Rockies office is in Bozeman, where we focus on primarily the public lands and wildlife of the Northern Rockies region. I want to talk with you today about, where do I point this in order to, the development of the law, the judicial precedent, et cetera, concerning national forest roadless area protection. Protection and management of those lands that for many of us are the reason why we care about the national forests in the first place, because they're the places that we go for recreation. We take our children, we go hunting, we hike, we fish, and when we think of the national forest, we often think of these lands. However, the management of these lands is among the most contentious issues in the history of the agency. Last night, during Professor Wilkinson's speech, he talked about some of the Forest Service's finest moments resulting from the work of visionaries. And here are two of those visionaries. Aldo Leopold on the left, author of the Sand County Almanac. Bob Marshall on the right. Marshall, who died at 39 but left a tremendous legacy for all of us. Both founders of the Wilderness Society, but before that, both worked for the Forest Service, and they made tremendous strides in establishing new concepts that resonate still today for the agency. Leopold, in 1924, along with others, led the effort by which the Forest Service, for the first time of any government in the history of the world, designated an area of a nation's land to remain as wilderness, 574,000 acres of the Gila National Forest. Marshall, shortly later, Leopold's idea was then embodied by the Forest Service in what was called the L-20 regulations, in which the idea of wilderness by administrative declaration spread across 14.2 million acres, and the primitive area system was established. Now note that the primitive areas were protected from road construction and resort development, and that reflects what were the pressures primarily on the forests at the time in terms of development. Not so much logging in 1929, it was not an issue, but Marshall came along and perceived that as a weakness and a gap. So in 1939, largely through Marshall's leadership, the Forest Service established the U regulations, 14.5 million acres of primitive wilderness, wild and canoe areas protected from virtually all development, including roads and logging. Now, we also talked last night during Professor Wilkins' speech about the visionaries, but as former Chief Thomas pointed out, there's always a political overlay. So why were Leopold and Marshall able to get traction with these somewhat radical ideas? Well, maybe the answer lies in the fact that a fledgling National Park Service was casting greedy eyes on the National Forest System for lands to turn into national parks. And the Park Service was requesting transfers from Congress of some of the most pristine and beautiful national forest scenic areas for national park development. The Forest Service accepted the ideas of Marshall and Leopold in some respects as an antidote to that threat that they were facing. We can establish our own protections. We don't need to turn the forests over to the national park system. So that was phase one. Last night we talked about the various phases of the Forest Service policy development. That was the phase one era. Phase two came along with the post-World War II housing boom, the demands for logging on the national forest, the dramatic increase in the cut from the national forest. There were a number of legislative reactions. One of those was the 1964 Wilderness Act, a reaction to increased threat of logging in some of the most treasured landscapes of the national forests. As defined by Congress in a poetic language, the Wilderness Act established areas where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. And here we see the Bob Marshall Wilderness, named for Marshall, of course, the pioneer of this concept. The Wilderness Act itself designated 9.1 million acres as wilderness, including the Bob Marshall, and began the wilderness system, which has since developed through legislative enactments over time. But that raised an important question. So now we have this wilderness system. What about all the areas? We saw there were 14.5 million acres of primitive areas. There's 9.1 million acres of wilderness. What about the rest of it? What about these other undeveloped lands? Well, there were two important court rulings in the wake of the Wilderness Act, one dealing with the Forest Service's administrative protection efforts, one dealing with the Forest Service's land development efforts. First, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1965, in a case called McMichael versus United States, made clear that the Forest Service's administrative regulations protecting roadless areas were still valid. They were consistent with both the Wilderness Act and the Forest Service Organic Act. An important principle, because of course the industry and others pointed to the wilderness areas and say, okay, great, we didn't like it, but you've got your Wilderness Act, now those are your wilderness areas, now we get the rest. So it was an important step for the courts to affirm that it was still open to the Forest Service to administratively protect these areas. And then there was the Parker case in 1971, a very important case because the Forest Service was trying to log a roadless area adjacent to a primitive area, and conservationists sued, and the court ruled that the Wilderness Act prohibited the Forest Service from precluding congressional consideration of a wilderness designation for these roadless areas until the President and Congress evaluated the areas for wilderness designation. So that put the Forest Service in a pickle. It had all these areas that there was a strong constituency out there. They wanted to get in and do some logging and road building into a lot of these areas, and they had to figure out how they could deal with this problem of presenting the issue to Congress and the President to make a decision. And that's where we got two processes, one after another, because there were, of course, challenges to each, the roadless area review and evaluation processes. So those were essentially inventories of the National Forest System to see what do we have left in terms of those undeveloped landscapes that were reserved from the public domain by presidents much, much earlier in the Forest Service's history. And what we had left then is a lot like what we have left today, although there's certainly been erosion. Essentially, you've got 31% of the National Forest System that is roadless, but not protected by Congress. 18% designated wilderness, and then you got 51%, the so-called multiple-use landscape, but essentially what we're talking about here is an already eroded landscape. So that's what the fight is about, is that last 31% chunk. And what are we talking about when we talk about that area? Well, here in the Northern Rockies, we're talking about some of our most prized and valued landscapes. Yes, we all obviously love Glacier and Yellowstone parks, Bob Marshall Wilderness, but what we may not understand is that the connective tissue for those treasured landscapes, a lot of that exists in the unprotected, roadless areas. So we're talking about the Rocky Mountain Front west of Choteau. We're talking about the Badger II Medicine on the southeast border of Glacier National Park. We're talking about Scotchman's Peak in northwest Montana. We're talking about in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge, places like the Pioneers and the Snowcrest Range, the West Big Hole, a lot of these landscapes that generations have sought out for various activities and may not have known all the time that this is a landscape that is very much in jeopardy. But perhaps people will say, well, yeah, that roadless stuff is great, but don't we need roads? I mean, how are we going to access these areas? Don't we need roads to get around? Well, that's Montana, the Wild West. And as you can see, we have a lot of opportunity to get places on roads. What we don't have, even in Montana, the last best place is a whole lot of unroaded areas. And when we think about the resources of the nation and the eastern half of the country, those roadless areas become all the more treasured. And we heard a little bit this morning about single-use management and how threatened and endangered species management has sort of taken precedence over the multiple-use mission on some Forest Service lands. But let's think about it in terms of if you have a statute that says preserve the ecosystems upon which species depend, where else are those ecosystems in existence but in the National Forest System and on those landscapes we see there? There's Wyoming. I think their slogan is "The Wild West lives here," or something like that. And as you can see, what's wild in Wyoming is, much like Montana, confined to the parks and the National Forest System. And credit to the Forest Service. Although, you know, some of this is certainly about a critique of some of the Forest Service management over time, but the fact that here we are in 2011, and we have these lands still, and some of it has been about acts of Congress in response to citizens who protested Forest Service efforts, but some of it has been about the Forest Service recognizing the value of these areas and having courageous people over time who provided this legacy to us today. So now we get into the Phase 3 period. This is another visionary's work in many respects. Mike Dombeck, along with others in the Agriculture Department in the Clinton administration, began the process of addressing through a new regulatory framework these roadless areas. And yes, there was a visionary, but yes, there was a political overlay. The Clinton administration supported this effort. In January 1998, the Forest Service began to take new direction in dealing with the roadless issue with a temporary road building moratorium for the remaining roadless areas. Didn't go unchallenged. We talked about environmental litigation. Well, the Wyoming timber industry also likes to go to the courts when it suits their purposes, and we see that the timber industry challenged that right off the bat, but they were rejected by the federal court in Wyoming. That opened the opportunity for the Forest Service in January 2001 to create the Roadless Area Conservation Rule. Now, what is the Roadless Area Conservation Rule? It declares that for the remaining 58.5 million acres of roadless areas of the National Forest System, there generally will be no road construction or timber cutting. However, there are exceptions. Roads needed to address a threat of fire that would cause loss of life or property, grandfathered mineral leases because there are mineral leases on some of these lands that predate the rule, and logging to maintain or restore ecosystem composition and structure. But in general, it's a secure protection for these lands. So what's the public response? Well, the roadless area rulemaking had more participation than any other rulemaking in the history of the United States government. More public comment and more public participation. More than 90% of the comments supported the rule. But the rule came down in January 2001, which, if you recall your history, was when the Clinton administration was giving way to the Bush administration. The Bush administration had a very different view of how to manage national forests, roadless areas. And in the early days of the Bush administration, they were confronted with this dilemma. They had this rule that had been handed to them by the Clinton administration. They did not like it, but they didn't want to take the political hit for taking down a very popular rule. So a Senate subcommittee subpoenaed Internal Ag Department records from this period, and it's interesting. There's one document that's got a handwritten note on it, which represents, I believe, the culmination of their internal decision process. Let judge take rule down. And that was their strategy. So in April 2001, the industry, Boise Cascade was the prime architect of this lawsuit, but the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho was the first named plaintiff. Filed lawsuit in the District of Idaho. The Idaho District Court issued a preliminary injunction against the roadless rule, and the Bush administration declined to appeal. They acquiesced in the demise of the rule based on the one judge decision in Idaho. We did not acquiesce. And on behalf of conservation groups, we filed an appeal to represent the public's interest in this rule. And December 2002, the Ninth Circuit agreed with us that the Idaho judge got it wrong, reversed the preliminary injunction, and put the roadless rule into effect for the first time. And in so doing, the Ninth Circuit said many interesting things about the national forests, but one of the things it recognized this concept that we were talking about earlier in terms of where else can these resources exist. Many sensitive wildlife species, whether mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, insects, or other organisms, make their homes in wild and roadless areas of forest and can know no other life. We cannot properly be unmindful of the fact that mountain lion, elk, wolverine, grizzly bears, wolves, and other threatened species need roadless areas to survive. That was not the end of the story, however. The state of Wyoming, along with development interests in Wyoming, brought their own challenge in the Wyoming District Court. And once again, in 2003, the Wyoming court issued an injunction against the roadless rule. Again, the Bush administration declined to appeal. Again, we appealed. This time, the 10th Circuit vacated the Wyoming court's injunction. That means it lifted it, upon finding the case moot. Now, why was the case moot? In 2005, the Bush administration decided we're not going to take chances with these appeals courts anymore. So they issued a rule called the State Petitions Rule the day after oral argument in the 10th Circuit on the appeal of the Wyoming decision. It repealed the roadless rule outright and substituted in place a state petitioning process, which essentially meant there is no administrative protection for roadless areas unless a state petitions to establish them. And of course, in states like Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Alaska, and others that I'm sure all of you can think of, waiting for a state governor to petition to protect these areas essentially means they will remain unprotected. So this time, we brought the litigation. In 2006, California District Court held that the state petitions rule was unlawful and ordered reinstatement of the roadless rule. This time, the Bush administration appealed. However, in August 2009, the Ninth Circuit affirmed our victory. So where are we now? Well, I wish I could say that had been the last chapter. But in August 2008, Wyoming got back into the act, refiled their Wyoming case. The Wyoming judge reissued his same decision. This time we had a different administration, and both the Obama administration and us appealed the decision to the 10th Circuit. where we still await a 10th Circuit ruling. If reversed by the 10th Circuit, the Wyoming ruling is reversed, that is, the roadless rule will become the unchallenged law of the land. But where does that really leave us? In reality, throughout the history of the Forest Service, these lands have been the subject of controversy and dispute. They always need public support and public efforts for protection, and likely they always will. Whatever victories or defeats we sustain in this moment, although they are certainly important, the battle will have to be refought by the next generation and the next. And we have the efforts of prior generations to thank for the fact that we still have 58.5 million acres of roadless areas to dispute over. But it will take the efforts of our generation and the next to ensure that the fate of those areas remains an open question as opposed to one that's been resolved as it has for so many of our public lands and certainly almost all of our undeveloped private lands. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks to all of our three speakers. I think it would be a good time if you all would turn on your microphones, and if you have some reactions to each other's presentations, let's take a few minutes to have a little dialogue up here, and then I'm sure we have some thoughts and questions and comments from the audience.
Now it's on. I really like that last presentation. As a out of office now, I can tell you that I thought that was roadless rule was one of the best moves that Don Beck could do. We don't have roadless areas by accident, guys. We built roads in anywhere that made much sense and some where it didn't make much sense. Our road system is not being maintained properly because we simply don't get the money for it. Congress lets you build roads, but they don't, once you pull the material out, they're not very enthusiastic about maintaining them. So I thought that was a really good move, but it might be noted that our congressman from Montana right now has a piece of legislation which he's introduced to attack this from another direction. I can also tell you that within probably a week or 10 days, with my signature on top and several other chiefs followed up, there will be, we're going to take on our congressman from Montana relative to the relaxation of that roadless rule. We'll see how that turns out. I even volunteered to carry the testimony, so and I would look forward to that. Thanks.
I think, managing national forests as a district ranger, it seems like a lot of effort was focused on those roadless areas. And I realized early that, there wasn't, from a commodity resource standpoint, there wasn't much reason to go into those areas. The cost of building roads was very high. And so, it would really never pay. Really, I think the challenge for the country is the roadless areas are really waiting for decision from Congress. Are they going to be managed as wilderness? And that has been very contentious for a long period of time. Some people have advocated a different category that allows certain different types of management activities in some of those lands. So, as Tim pointed out, there's going to be a struggle for another generation or two.
I just want to react briefly to, I enjoyed all the presentations. One thing I do want to respond to, former Chief Thomas set out to be provocative, and he provoked me on one point, which was the Equal Access to Justice Act, which is something you hear about in the news quite a bit right now. Let me just say a couple things about that. First of all, the idea, which Jack did not say, that people are out here getting rich on lawsuits against the Forest Service would be really interesting to my wife, considering I took a 60% pay cut when I left a private law firm to work for Earth Justice. The work that we do is not about trying to make the most money we can make. On the other hand, I will say we have not filed, I have not had a our office has not had a national forest logging case since the early days of the Bush administration. So to be honest with you, I don't see those logging cases as being where the action is right now on the national forest, but I'm aware that some folks continue to bring them. I don't think that so I will say that at this point, it's sort of the hardcore anti-logging folks who are pushing that agenda, and I honestly don't think that taking away the Equal Access to Justice Act is going to shut those folks down. It's not about, for them, it's not going to be about whether they get a court-awarded fee award. I will say this as well. We hear a lot of bad things about litigation, and certainly litigation is not a perfect public land management tool by any means. And I as somebody who litigates, I recognize that. However, there's a couple things I would ask you all to keep in mind when you think about litigation over the national forests. One is, if we hadn't had the right to litigate to protect the national forests, where would we be right now? We would have oil and gas leasing and development of the Rocky Mountain Front. We would have oil and gas leasing and development of the North Fork Flathead River. We would have a gold mine on the northeast corner of Yellowstone National Park. And that's all just in the Northern Rockies, right off the top of my head. So think about where how much do we care about those lands, and what were the tools that were used to get us to the point today where they're protected? And certainly, there were a lot of things that happened, and public support and collaboration were part of it, but at the outset, there was a lawsuit that shifted the entitlements, that told the agency no, and then made possible the breakthrough to protect those lands. And then the other point is, I ask you, do we really want an agency that doesn't have a judicial backstop, where there's no judge looking over their shoulder to make sure that they adhere to the law? You know, the EJA only awards fees to a prevailing party, meaning that you have to prove the Forest Service violated the law before there is a fee award. And not only do you have to prove they violated the law, you have to prove their position was not substantially justified. So do we really want a situation where the Forest Service can act illegally in an unjustified manner and there's no corrective? I think those are important questions.
Before we leave that, I'd like to respond to that. Absolutely, I believe the Forest Service should have to obey the damn law. That's not my point. But when you give people an incentive to sue you with no consequences on the downside, that takes up incredible amounts of time and money to do that. I like the Equal Access to Justice Act. I like the idea that you can sue the government, but I don't like the idea that you can just raise havoc with that law with no consequence. If you want to absorb the cost, and some people use that thing like a sledgehammer, whether they win or not, all they got to do is, it really is I just want somebody to have some responsibility for what they do. I'd love for you to hand me a ticket and say, I can go around and sue anybody I want with no consequence. There's no downside. If you're willing to absorb that, you can make things so damned expensive by timing your lawsuits exactly right. That costs you a year, and that costs you another year, and then you appeal for some more time, and whether you get it or not, now the question's moot. You've burned up so much money and so much time, it's cheaper to just give up. So it's got some downsides to it. I want to see it maintained, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how you fix that, but it also can be used, and is sometimes, in my opinion, used inappropriately. Sometimes the results have been fantastic, but I don't want a Forest Service or anybody else not to have to obey the law. And we have to understand that when we lose, and we're not in compliance with the law. But when you watch that thing being manipulated and used very, very adroitly just to simply stop things, I think there needs to be some way that that's tempered.
Last night, in the keynote address, Professor Wilkinson noted that this judicial review possibility, especially when it's raised in the middle of a conflict, can lead parties to some fairly creative, forward-looking collaborations. It's not always, I guess, a all or nothing, win or lose. Sometimes the fact that there's this possibility gives people incentives to participate in the administrative process. But I wonder if we could move from the judicial review side of this to another point you made, Jack, and that was that you've in other settings you've used the phrase the blob, the big mess of federal laws that have built up over time, and together with regulations and policies and court decisions as well, that pull the agency in so many different directions. And you made the statement today pretty strongly that the agency needs a new trumpet call, a new direction from the people. I'd be interested in the other panelists commenting on whether it would be advisable to have some new legislative statement. And given the history of the agency, has that proven to be a helpful thing? And what could we be talking about here at this conference about a useful direction to help guide the agency into the future?
Jack?
Me, all right. I refer to it, I've been working on a paper for a while, and I guess it's ready to be published now, called Who Shall Answer? Two quotes from the Bible. I'm not particularly religious, but there's some really great quotes there. One is, who shall answer an uncertain trumpet? And then the other is, depending on the interpretation, in the absence of vision, the people perish. It's not clear to what it is the Forest Service is supposed to be doing. In fact, I refer to it in that paper as a Gordian knot of interacting, sometimes conflicting laws, court cases, guidance, this, that, and the other, that simply is so tight that there is not going to be any really active management in the Forest Service until that's clarified. Now, there's two ways to look at that. Is if, all you got to do is get a book, that, which I promise you most Forest Service people don't read, of all of those consequences and what ties this and that, and you sit there and you talk to your lawyers and you look at them and you say, God damn, I got 4 college degrees and a PhD, and I don't understand what you guys are talking about. And it's not because I'm stupid. There ain't nobody can understand that. So my consequence is, what do we need to tinker with? Every time you tinker, it just puts more ropes in that knot that the lawyers get to litigate, and they finally figure out what that means, whether you agree with it or not, is that I think there's some guidance in ancient mythology where Alexander said, they presented him with a Gordian knot and said, the man that can pick this apart will be the ruler of Asia. And many had failed. He looked at it a minute and pulled out his sword and gave it a whack. I think we're at the point we need to pull a sword and give it a whack and get this down to some very clear direction in law as to what the folks are supposed to be doing. They'll do it. I promise you they'll do it. And they'll do it very well and very effectively. And they'll pursue it. But they don't know where they're going. Where they're going, Sal. Quo vadis, where are you going? They don't know. They deserve clarification, whatever that clarification turns out to be.
I think from a kind of a retired district ranger standpoint, because of this impasse on kind of a multiple-use management and using all the tools that have been used in the past, to address certain issues like people have debated for a long time and probably concluded rightly that the fire management, the 10 a.m. policy and putting out all fires has changed the vegetation, especially in dry forests in the West. And so what are the tools available to go back from an ecosystem management standpoint to kind of make those stands structure look more like they functioned in the past? timber sales was an important aspect of doing that now. Some timber sales are still occurring, but maybe not enough. And as Jack pointed out, the cost of doing a timber sale or a stewardship project that is called today requires an immense amount of analysis and NEPA documentation, you know, that can run into hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million for projects. You know, given our budget crisis today, that kind of money, you know, might not be readily available. Another aspect too, I think is important as the Forest Service multiple-use lessons have kind of been muddled over the years. The lack of the infrastructure in order to implement decisions to manage vegetation on the forest has gone away as mills close and and the country obtains more wood from other countries, and that has had a very adverse effect on rural economies, and the population of many rural communities are decreasing, and I think that has a bad negative effect over time that we need to look at.
Well, I guess obviously these folks know better than I do the situation inside the Forest Service. In terms of the question, do we need a new legislative enactment? You know, the courts have held that the current system, the current legal framework for the Forest Service, quote, breathes discretion at every pore. I think you've got a system that can be manipulated pretty much to justify any outcome. I think from my perspective, the problem for the Forest Service isn't that the law doesn't let it do what it wants to do, it's that sometimes what it wants to do is not what the public wants from the national forests. And in terms of, I absolutely agree that there are issues of understory, fuel removal. I think one of the problems that persists is there remains a lot of mistrust of the Forest Service, and while that was starting to kind of get tamped down, I think it got fired back up by the Bush administration. And I think a lot of folks feel that, you know, the Forest Service says, oh, we want to do fuel reduction, but that's kind of become a stalking horse for projects that really sometimes don't have a great nexus to really fireproofing an area, as much as it looks like maybe some of them are trying to get into some bigger, older trees that, you know, I think there's a consensus had not to be the focus of Forest Service timber program at this time.
We have plenty of, we're taking time for questions and discussion, and we have a big group in a big room, and we're recording this, so Josh is going to carry the microphone and so that we can capture your question. Should we start with Martin? Do you have a question? Do you want to take that? Well, we're recording it, so let's try that. Thanks.
I'll run it to you anyway.
Tim, a question for you. First of all, tell us what's going to happen in the 10th Circuit with the roadless rule. Number two, I'd like to get your sense of my read of the roadless rule and the politics and the conservation communities. There's two different ways of seeing that roadless rule. One is that a lot of groups tend to see it as a temporary stopgap measure. Administrative protection, hold those pieces in place until they can be negotiated at a further point, you know, in terms of wilderness designation. And on the other hand, you have some that see that 2001 roadless rule, if it's upheld by the 10th Circuit, as being the end of the story. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, in terms of what is the 10th Circuit going to do, if I could tell you that, if I could tell you the outcomes of these court decisions, I would be a lot more successful. What I can tell you is that the oral argument occurred in March of 2010. It's now September of 2011, and that's an extraordinary amount of time for even the slow-turning wheels of justice to continue grinding away on a case. So who knows what all that means. We can sit and speculate, but it's nothing more than speculation. What is the roadless rule just, to me, and the reason that my organization has devoted a decade of work to defending the rule, it's a critical baseline that we don't see as something that's going to be a chip in a negotiating game, but rather that it's an important national recognition that these lands are going to generally remain undeveloped, that they're going to be part of our principle, so to speak, of undeveloped natural resources. And in terms of, you know, there's always going to be a move. Every generation is going to want to come back to those lands and make a compromise. And, there's always pushes, we ought to have a collaborative solution. I don't have a problem with collaboration in principle, but what I am concerned about is, seizing upon collaborative outcomes as a good unto themselves. I'm a little bit worried about the trajectory of a system in which each generation celebrates keeping half of what it started with. And I fear that if we sort of say, okay, we have a stopgap, now let's cut a deal, that's where we're headed.
I have a question for Chief Thomas, and first of all, I want to say that we really appreciate your perspective, and I think we need to hear that. Lawyers and academics and law students need to understand what life in the trenches is like, and I appreciate your comments today and last night. But I do want to take issue with one thing you said here and ask you to respond to it. You said the mission statement of the Forest Service is defined by the Organic Act and multiple use sustained yield. And I think that NIFMA added a new mission statement to the Forest Service, and that biodiversity was part of that, and the regulation is couched in mandatory terms, the use of the word shall. It's not simply guidance. And so I think part of the problem is, especially historically in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, was a reluctance to perhaps embrace that new mission that led to a lot of litigation. And maybe the mission is too broad now. Maybe it's too much in this political time, but I guess I would like your reflection on whether or not the mission statement is more than timber and water and the multiple uses, but in fact has some specific biodiversity and other mandates that are part of NIFMA that was an effort to change the agency's mission.
Whether I think that's clear in law or not, it's pretty clear to everybody else. But maintenance of biodiversity? Can you even tell me what the biodiversity is on a single 10-acre piece of ground? If you can't, and you don't know any projection about what something would do to that biodiversity, you simply are in a position of doing nothing. Because there is no manipulation that you will do on any piece of ground that will not have an adverse effect on biodiversity or a positive effect, but the diversity will be different before and after the treatment. So what is biodiversity defined as all those creatures who exist in plants and animals and microbes and all these other things on a piece of ground. That changes after a fire. That changes after a logging operation. That changes every time something happens. It's not a static thing. The dream was we draw a circle around something and the biodiversity will remain the same. I promise you when that stand burns, it will not be the same. I promise you that a long drought, it will not be the same. So I think that is a code word for leave it the hell alone, which suits me just fine, but there's no necessity to jerk around scientific terms, this, that, and the other, to justify leave it the hell alone. Just put that in the law, leave it the hell alone, and quit fogging up the world with this pseudoscience of, we talked yesterday where they turned around and made a pretty good presentation of those sorts of things. If you look at the Northwest Forest Plan, we're going to save spotted owls. Yeah, really? No, by God, we're going to save biodiversity. Really? Are we going to save a bunch of really big, beautiful, old-growth trees, and if we cut too damn many of them and we're not ever going to have any more? Tell it like the hell it is. Don't cut any more old growth, you jerk. That was, don't have to fog it up with all this other stuff. So now, barred owls, just to make a point. Oh, we got scientific indicator species. The whole Northwest Forest Plan is predicated on the indicator species of the northern spotted owl. It's declining very rapidly now. Why? We got a new species that's superseding it. It's called evolution, a barred owl. So now we're going to save spotted owls by shooting barred owls. Come on, guys. The world changes. It evolves. It moves. We're in global warming. If you think the biodiversity of those stands, given the fact that I believe that it is warming, that 35 years from now, the same set of biodiversity is going to exist. This is an evolutionary process that's going on that we want to fix in time by law, and we can't do it. And so you charge managers with doing things that's nebulous in the first place, and then certainly is constantly changing. For example, you would, with all these requirements for survey and manage and this, that, and the other, sit down with somebody who has experience with survey and how much money you have to spend to get within plus or minus 30, 40%, and then being unable to determine the difference between perturbations in population, responses to weather patterns, droughts, and this, that, and the other, and get something meaningful out of that. There's other ways to spend money that would be a hell of a lot more profitable to the preservation of biodiversity than those sorts of things. Is biodiversity a code word for don't touch it? Well, if it is, just put it in there. Don't do it. Don't touch it. Don't complicate it with all of these words that are don't mean the same thing to everybody and are almost impossible to deal with technically.
I don't know if I can follow up with Jack's comment there, but I just want to make one point about, I've used the term multiple use and other people have too. I consider multiple use as really all uses, and many people in the public might use the term to mean just commodity type uses. So when I use the term multiple use, it applies all uses, whether it's recreation, amenity type values, commodity type production.
Tim, did you have anything? I think we have time for one more question to stay on schedule here, so.
We'll get there in time.
This is just a general question for anyone on the panel who wants to have some input on it. But there's been a lot of talk about the Northwest Forest Plan and whether that is effective in preserving the owl or not. I'm curious about the panel's opinion on acts such as the ONC Lands Act that tie the economic fate of certain communities to outputs off of the forest lands. Do you think there's still a place for that? And if not, where do we go with that type of a law?
Okay, being as I'm the daddy of the Northwest Forest Plan, I'm not sure I really quite understood the question. Could you put it in, a 10-word question?
Sure. Should we continue to tie the economic fate of communities to the outputs that are required under the ONC lands law and things like that, other laws like that?
Okay. Whether we should or not, we're going to. We're, particularly today, I don't know, I get my retirement check, so I'm not suffering. All the bureaucrats in the room are still getting paid, so they're not suffering. But I don't know if you've noticed, guys, there's a presidential campaign going on that's jobs, jobs, jobs. Whatever in the hell is in the way of jobs, jobs, jobs is going to be in jeopardy. And whether we like it or not, to the man, there is an economic, social parameter related to the management of public lands that relates to jobs, relates to income to communities, relates to all of those things. And the Forest Service and any other government agency is going, first, the congressmen are going to respond to it. Secondly, all elected officials are going to respond to it. They go to Congress and Congress does their thing. Presidents do their thing. Do I suspect that there's going to be some pressure coming down pretty quick for more attention to the production of either commodities or employment of people to do varying things? Yeah, I suspect that's going to be coming fairly strong. And we're going to have to be careful that in our frenzy to address those things, we don't lose the ground for the betterment of national forest and other attributes. But pressure's coming. And can you visualize Rick Perry, for example, giving instructions to the Forest Service? It might be a little bit different than the ones that they're getting now, or even the ones now the Bush administration, they made their try, and they were thwarted. And to be frank about it, they just weren't thwarted by lawsuits and environmental concern. There was some thwarting that went on internal to the government to say, I ain't doing it. And they made it stay. So I think, though, the next 4 or 5 years is going to be very, very interesting related to the things that we're discussing. I suspect, and I don't want to pick on my first cousin, Mr. Perry, we went to school at the same institution, Harvard on the Brazos. But it's going to be different. It doesn't make much difference who is elected. Mr. Obama's suddenly deciding that some other things. That's enough of that. But the next 10 years are not going to be the same as the last 10, for my opinion.
And we are focusing on the economic issues related to national forests in the final session of this conference on Friday morning. Anybody else want a final thought here? We need to close for a break, but go ahead.
Real briefly, I think my answer to your question is no. I guess I would say I think if we look around Montana and largely around the West, and this is, I suspect, something that'll come up during your panel, the communities that are flourishing as a result of proximity to the national forests are not the mill towns and the places that are looking to extract something from them. They're the places for which the forests provide an amenity backdrop that draws in a much more diverse economic forces, and I don't see that changing.
I have to respond to that. That sort of input has been going up steadily for 40 years, regardless of what the programs were on the national forest. They didn't suddenly start to blossom today because of those amenities. Those amenities have always been there. That use continued to increase steadily, regardless of what the management regime was at the time. So to stop the world so that'll keep coming is not borne out by the data that they've been keeping since the 1930s. More and more people hungry for outdoor recreation and this, that, and the other are attracted to those lands where they can get on them without any trespass fees, or they don't have to be worried about any of those things. But there's no statistical correlation between we get more recreational use on the national forest in general than we get in wilderness areas or any of those other things. In fact, that's a relatively minor portion of the recreational use.
And that is a big focus of the conversation on Friday morning, so to be continued. And would you join me in thanking these panelists for this great starting session?